My name is Elias Thorne, and for as long as I can remember, my life has been shaped by the quiet, steady rhythm of creation. My grandfather was a master carpenter, a man who believed that the true measure of a person was not in the noise they made, but in the integrity of what they built. He taught me how to read the grain of oak, how to feel the balance of a well-made tool, and how to find a deep, resonant peace in the patient act of bringing something of value into the world. He left me his workshop, his philosophy, and a surprisingly intricate family trust, all built on the same principle: construct things to last and protect them from those who would carelessly tear them down. For 15 years, I tried to build a marriage with Isabel on that same foundation. I thought our different natures would complement each other, me quiet introspection, a steady anchor for her vibrant, social energy. I loved the way she filled a room with laughter, the way her presence felt like sunlight after a long winter. But over time, I began to realize she wasn't building with me. She was decorating a life she felt I ought to provide, a stage on which she could perform. My quietness was not a strength to her, but a void she needed to fill with noise. My work, which involved managing the complex architectural and financial structures of my family's foundation, was dismissed as hobby numbers. She never asked, not really. To her, I was just the steady, predictable man in the background. The foundation was just a name on a letterhead. The end came not with a crash, but with the sharp, brittle sound of a slammed drawer. "You're lucky I'm even giving you this much notice," she muttered, her voice tight with a frustration that had been simmering for years. She was forcing a silk dress into an already overstuffed suitcase, the fabric whispering in protest. Her perfume, a scent I once loved, now hung in the air of our bedroom like a declaration of war, heavy and suffocating. "I've wasted enough years on this." I didn't respond. I sat at the small kitchen table, a spoon in my hand, my bowl of oatmeal growing cold. The rhythmic clatter of plastic hangers being discarded onto the bed was the only conversation in the house. She didn't look at me once, not until she was standing by the front door, her oversized sunglasses already shielding her from a world she was desperate to rejoin, one that I was apparently holding her back from. "We're done, Elias," she said, the words as flat and polished as the marble floor in our hallway. She adjusted the strap of her designer bag on her shoulder. "You'll hear from my lawyer." A strange, hollow feeling settled in my chest. It wasn't anger or even surprise. It was the quiet grief of acceptance. I had known this was coming, in the way you know a storm is coming by the stillness in the air. I just nodded. She tilted her head, a gesture I once found charming, now condescending. It was the same look she gave waiters who were too slow with the wine list. "From now on, you'll only speak to my attorney." "Understood." She offered a tight, triumphant smile, as if she had just won a silent, protracted battle. The door clicked shut, a sound both definitive and remarkably soft. She didn't ask if I would be all right. She didn't ask about our old golden retriever, Leo, who was currently hiding under the table, his tail thumping a nervous rhythm against the wood. She didn't ask about the life we had built, because in her mind, she was the sole architect, and I was merely the tenant. I sat there for a long time, listening to the silence she left behind. It was different from the peaceful quiet I cherished. This was an empty silence, a space that had once held laughter and arguments and the soft murmur of shared sleep. Tonight, it felt like an accusation. Later, when the moon cast long shadows across the living room floor, I didn't reach for a bottle of whiskey or a photo album. I went down to the workshop my grandfather had left me, a place Isabel had always called Elias's dusty shed. The air smelled of cedar and linseed oil, a scent that had always grounded me. Behind a false panel in an old tool cabinet, a place she never would have thought to look, was a safe. Not for valuables, but for principles. Inside was a single, leather-bound volume. Its spine was embossed with the family crest, a simple oak tree. The title read, The Oakhaven Charter. It was a document my grandfather had drafted with his attorneys decades ago, a framework for how the Thorne family assets and endeavors were to be managed, protected, and passed down. It was less a legal document and more a constitution, filled with clauses on stewardship, integrity, and responsibility. I had updated it 4 years ago, after a particularly pointed conversation where Isabel had joked at a dinner party that my little trust fund was lucky to have her to help spend it. She believed my work was little more than glorified bookkeeping. She didn't understand that the Oakhaven Trust wasn't a passive inheritance. It was an active, sprawling enterprise of ethical investments, architectural preservation projects, and venture capital. When I had once tried to explain the concept of a morality clause in our venture funding agreements, she'd waved a dismissive hand and said, "Darling, you're so much more charming when you're not trying to sound like a textbook." So I stopped trying. But I didn't stop planning. I opened the charter to Section 4, subsection C. The clause had a simple, unassuming title: Delegation of Fiduciary Dialogue. It was a quiet little safeguard my grandfather, a man who had been through one bitter divorce himself, had insisted upon. It stated, in dense but clear language, that if a marital partner formally and exclusively delegated all communication to an external legal party, they would trigger a temporary transfer of administrative authority over any jointly held or beneficiary-designated assets within the trust. It was designed to prevent a hostile, emotionally driven dissolution from dismantling decades of careful work. All it required was a clear, recorded declaration. Our home security system, which Isabel assumed was just for show, was always on. The small red light could be turned off, but the recording never stopped. This wasn't about revenge. I felt no surge of triumph, only a deep, abiding sadness. This was about preservation. It was about honoring the work of a man who taught me that the strongest structures are the ones built quietly, with patience and foresight. People mistake quiet for weakness. They assume a man who doesn't raise his voice has no voice at all. They see calmness in the face of abandonment and call it defeat. They are wrong. Sometimes, quiet is simply the sound of a foundation settling, preparing to bear a new weight. The next morning, Isabel's social media was a portrait of liberation. A picture of champagne flutes against a city skyline, captioned, "A New Dawn. Onwards and upwards." She had no idea that the ground beneath her was already being carefully, legally, and irrevocably excavated. Her lawyer, a man named Leo Vance, operated out of a sleek, minimalist office that felt more like an art gallery than a legal practice. He was young, wore suits that cost more than my car, and had a smile that never quite reached his eyes. Isabel probably hired him because his website promised disruptive and assertive representation. "He's not contesting?" Isabel asked, her voice, recorded on a call with a friend and later forwarded to me by a concerned acquaintance, was a mix of surprise and smug satisfaction. Leo said he received the signed separation agreement this morning. No notes, no pushback. He just signed it. Honestly, easiest divorce I've ever handled, Leo had apparently told her, a fact she repeated with a triumphant giggle. "He's just rolling over. You should be proud. You handled it like a surgeon." She sent me a single text message that afternoon, a digital twisting of the knife. "Looks like this was easier than I thought. Hope you land on your feet." She added a winking emoji, a small, cruel flourish that I knew was more for her own benefit than for mine. While she was celebrating her surgical victory, I was 2 hours north of the city, in a small town nestled in the Oakhaven Valley, a place where time seemed to flow a little slower. I was in the office of Eleanor Vancino, relation to Leo. A fact of cosmic irony, I appreciated the 80-year-old matriarch who had served as my family's notary and counsel for half a century. Her office smelled of old books and brewed tea, a stark contrast to the sterile, glass and chrome world Leo Vance inhabited. "Section 4, subsection C," she said, peering at the document through her bifocals, her voice raspy but firm. "Haven't had to invoke one of these since your grandfather dealt with that business partner from Boston in '88. You're certain?" "She made her choice, Eleanor," I said softly. She looked at me, her eyes clear and perceptive. "This isn't about punishment, is it, Elias?" "No," I replied, and I meant it. "It's about protecting what's been built." She nodded slowly, then took out her heavy, old-fashioned embosser. She stamped the documents with a satisfying thud. With that sound, the quiet gears that my grandfather had set in motion generations ago began to turn. The post-nuptial agreement Isabel had signed years ago, the one her first, less flashy lawyer had glanced over, was not just about assets. It was about values. It tied her beneficiary status not to our marriage, but to her active participation in and respect for the Oakhaven Charter. By declaring legal war, she had, by the Charter's own internal logic, forfeited her standing. She thought she was divorcing a mild-mannered man with a modest, inherited income. In reality, she had just abdicated her position in an ecosystem she never knew existed. And the man she was celebrating with, a charismatic tech entrepreneur named Julian, was about to discover the same thing. His startup, Ethereum Innovations, had just secured its final round of series of funding. The primary investor was a quiet little firm called Oakhaven Ventures. He, like Isabel, had never bothered to ask about the name. And he, like Isabel, had never read the fine print, specifically the morality clause tied to the personal conduct of the executive team, a standard feature in all of Oakhaven's investments. Isabel thought my silence was surrender. She mistook my calm for collapse. She didn't realize she was celebrating on a beautifully decorated stage, unaware that I was the one quietly dismantling the supports from below. First, she had to feel safe. Let her enjoy the view from the top. The fall would be that much more instructive. She called it a closure dinner. Her voice on the phone was smooth, magnanimous, as if she were a queen granting a final audience to a deposed courtier. For old time's sake, Elias, let's be adults about this. I agreed, not because I needed closure, but because I felt I owed it to the memory of the woman I once loved to see her one last time before the life she knew dissolved. I needed to know, for myself, that I had given her every chance to see beyond the surface. She chose a restaurant called Aperture, a place so aggressively trendy that the menu was projected onto the wall and the water was infused with esoteric botanicals. She was seated at a prime table by the window, bathed in the soft, flattering light, a perfect tableau for any friends who might happen to walk by. She wore a stunning black dress, one I'd never seen before. It was a declaration of her new life. I arrived in a simple tweed jacket and comfortable jeans. I wasn't there to make a statement. "You looked out well," she said, offering a cheek for a kiss that felt both intimate and utterly foreign. "So do you, Isabel," I replied, and I meant it. She was radiant, alight with the thrill of her perceived victory. She ordered an expensive bottle of French wine, chattering about her plans to travel, to take a pottery class, to rediscover her authentic self. The conversation was a monologue, punctuated only by my quiet nods. I listened, not to the words, but to the desperate energy beneath them. She was trying so hard to convince herself she had made the right choice. At one point, she leaned forward, her expression softening into something resembling pity. "You'll be okay, Elias. You always were so simple, predictable, content with your little projects." She smiled, as if bestowing a benediction. "It's one of the things I used to love about you." I looked at her, really looked at her, past the perfect makeup and the carefully constructed poise. And for the first time, I saw the fear in her eyes. The fear of being alone. The fear that she had thrown away something of substance for something glittering and hollow. She didn't ask about my life not out of arrogance, but because she was terrified of the answer. "Simplicity can be deceiving, Isabel," I said gently. She blinked, a flicker of uncertainty crossing her features. Then she laughed, a sound a little too loud for the quiet restaurant. "Oh, Elias. Always with your thoughtful little riddles. It's sweet, really." The wine arrived. As the sommelier poured, I placed a few bills on the table, enough to cover my water and a generous tip. I stood up. "Thank you for dinner, Isabel. I hope you find what you're looking for." Her smile faltered. "Wait, you're leaving? We just got the wine." "I think we've said everything we need to say," I replied. And with a final, sad smile, I walked out. I didn't look back. I knew she would sit there, swirling her wine, savoring what she believed was the taste of freedom. She wouldn't know that as she was lifting the glass to her lips, an automated email, scheduled days ago, was landing in the inbox of Julian's board of directors. The subject line was simple: Notice of Fiduciary Review. Attached was a discreet report detailing a significant conflict of interest and a breach of the Oakhaven Ventures morality clause. The dominoes were already falling. Not with a crash, but with a series of quiet, inexorable clicks. Because simplicity isn't weakness. It's clarity. And she had just made everything devastatingly clear. The first tremor hit Julian's world 48 hours later. It arrived not as a dramatic confrontation, but as a polite, sterile notification from his corporate counsel. His access to company funds had been suspended pending an emergency board meeting. He called Isabel in a panic. She, in turn, called Leo Vance, her voice a sharp staccato of disbelief and indignation. "What is he doing?" she demanded. "This has to be him. This is some kind of petty revenge." Leo, I imagine, tried to sound reassuring. "It's likely a coincidence, Isabel. A man like your husband doesn't have the leverage to influence a tech company's board. Let's stay focused on our settlement. He's already signed everything you wanted." But then the second envelope arrived at Leo's office. It was delivered by a quiet, professional courier. Inside was not a threat, but an invitation of formal notice for him, as Isabel's legal representative, to attend a mandatory fiduciary review of the Oakhaven Trust. Attached was a summary of the charter's governing principles and a copy of the post-nuptial agreement he had clearly never read in detail. That was when the professional panic must have set in. That was when he would have finally looked past the man his client described and seen the name on the documents, Elias Thorne, founding trustee and executive director. He would have cross-referenced Oakhaven Ventures and seen the same name. He would have understood, in a sudden, cold wave of dread, that he had not been negotiating a simple divorce. He had been unwittingly guiding his client off a cliff. He called me directly, for the first time. His voice had lost its smooth, confident cadence. It was strained, cautious. "Mr. Thorne, Elias, I think there's been a misunderstanding." "I don't believe so, Leo," I said calmly. "Everything is proceeding exactly as the charter dictates." My client was not aware of the full scope of these entanglements. "She was a signatory to all relevant documents," I replied, "and she was my wife for 15 years. An inquiry at any point would have been welcomed." The final meeting took place not in a lawyer's sterile conference room, but in my office. It was a space Isabel had never seen, located in a restored heritage building overlooking the Port Meridian harbor. The room was lined with bookshelves, architectural drawings, and models of the historic preservation projects the foundation funded. It was a room about building, not dismantling. Isabel arrived flanked by Leo, who looked pale and defeated. She, however, was a storm of righteous fury. "You planned this," she spat, her hands clenched into fists. "This entire time, you were setting me up." I remained seated behind my grandfather's old mahogany desk. "I planned for a contingency, Isabel. You chose the path that led us to it. You lied to me. You let me believe you were nothing." I finally met her gaze, and I let her see the years of quiet disappointment I had held inside. "I never lied. I was simply the man you saw. You just never looked very closely. You saw a quiet man who fixed the leaky faucet and balanced the checkbook. You never wondered what I was thinking about while I did it. You saw a hobbyist in a dusty workshop. You never asked what was being built." Leo cleared his throat, a desperate attempt to regain control. "My client is prepared to renegotiate, to communicate directly. According to the charter," I said, my voice even. "The window for direct communication closed the moment she delegated her voice to you. The process, once initiated, is irrevocable until the fiduciary review is complete." Isabel's face crumpled. The anger gave way to a dawning, terrifying understanding. "What does that mean? What review?" "It means the trust is now evaluating the totality of your shared assets and your standing as a beneficiary," I explained, as gently as I could. "And its conclusion is that your actions have demonstrated a fundamental opposition to the charter's core principles of partnership, integrity, and stewardship. Therefore, your beneficiary status is suspended indefinitely." She stared at me, her mouth slightly agape. All the fight went out of her. "The condo. My accounts." "The condo is owned by an LLC under the trust," I said softly. "The accounts were joint beneficiary accounts. They have been frozen, pending the audit." She sank into a chair, her bravado dissolving into raw, undisguised despair. Leo Vance stood silently, a statue of professional impotence. "Why?" she whispered, the single word hanging in the quiet room. "Why would you do this?" "You asked for this, Isabel," I said, and the sadness in my own voice surprised me. "When you said, 'From now on, you'll only speak to my attorney,' you weren't just ending a marriage. You were choosing a world of transactions over a world of connection, a world of contracts over a world of care. This is simply the world you chose, operating by its own rules." She left without another word. The sound of her weeping echoed in the hallway for a moment before fading away. The weeks that followed were a cascade of quiet, orderly consequences. Julian was voted out as CEO of his own company. The board, citing the morality clause, installed an interim leader from Oakhaven's own team. His reputation in the tech world was shattered overnight. Isabel's social circle, which had revolved around her status and wealth, evaporated. Friends stopped returning her calls. The invitations dried up. She had to move out of the condo and into a small, furnished apartment rented by her parents. I did not revel in it. Each piece of news felt like a necessary but painful surgery. I was removing a part of my life that had become toxic, but it was a part of me nonetheless. 6 months passed. The city slipped from the gold of autumn into the gray stillness of winter. I spent my days at the foundation, my evenings in the workshop, finding solace in the familiar scent of sawdust and the focused work of my hands. I was building a new life, one beam at a time. I was healing. One evening, a small, square envelope arrived in my mail. It had no return address. The handwriting was hers, but it was different from the confident, looping script I knew. It was smaller, more hesitant. Inside was a single sheet of notepaper. There were only 2 sentences. I went to your grandfather's workshop. I saw the rocking chair you were building. There was no apology, no demand, no accusation. Just a statement of fact. She had finally gone to the one place she had always dismissed. She had finally looked. I didn't know what it meant or where it would lead. It was not a reconciliation, and perhaps it never could be. But it was something. It was a flicker of light in the quiet space between us. I placed the note on my workbench, next to the half-finished chair. And for the first time in a very long time, I felt the quiet stirrings of hope, not for what was lost, but for what could still be built.